How do you make something true? To take a series of ideas, beliefs, and ideology and make them as immovable as the earth itself. Well, I guess stone is a good place to start. Today, I zoomed into Sevastopol, the largest city on the Crimean peninsula. Even Google Earth can't seem to pin down the truth here. For over 10 years, these red lines have encircled the peninsula. They mark disputed territory, and they're not alone in this region. It's a compromise on the mapmaker's part. One says this land is Ukraine, the other, Russia. But what is the truth here? If I zoom in, a shiny new answer is being prepared for me. Towards the east of the naval base which gave birth to the city, monumental construction is underway in Sevastopol. Looking down through the lattice of cranes and girders, I can almost hear the work through the screen. These are new parks, new monuments, a colossal opera house, but the magnum opus has to be New Chersonesus. It's a massive museum complex, over 1.5 million square feet, financed by a Russian state oil company and built by the Russian Department of Defense. For a while, I could only find scraps of information on it. Like the lines on the map, it's hard to know what the truth in these pixels is. But after slinking around on Russian sites for long enough, let me tell you about a lie. At the top, and still surrounded by the marks of construction in these 2024 photos, is the Museum of Antiquity in Byzantium. Across the park, at its southern end, is the domed outline of the Museum of Christianity. And here, between the two, is the Museum of Crimea in Novorossiya. This word, Novorossiya, translating into New Russia, is central to what is being hammered into stone here in New Chersonesus. It's a term borrowed from the Russian Empire and was originally used in the 1700s to describe its newly conquered territories in southeastern Ukraine. Its grouping here with Crimea is no coincidence. On the modern museum which bears these names, the visitor website boasts of fantastical bas-reliefs adorning its facade, carvings of an ancient baptism, foreign invaders, wartime heroism, and polite people.
Tuesday, about the identity of forces many assume are under his command, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered this explanation.
Look at the post-Soviet territory. There are a lot of uniforms that look similar to the uniform of the Russian army. Go to a shop here in our country, and you can buy any kind of uniform there.
Were they Russian military men?
These were local forces of self-defense.
In February 2014, as a pro-EU revolution ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, Russian special forces operating without insignia began to occupy airports and military bases throughout Ukrainian Crimea. Dubbed the Little Green Men for their plain green fatigues, Russian President Vladimir Putin vehemently denied they were associated with his military. The Russian media had a different name for the professionally armed force: polite people. It played into a rhetoric narrative of peaceful Russians rising up to return Crimea back to its homeland. A rhetoric that has stuck long after the admission that these soldiers stepped off helicopters flown in from the east. In New Chersonesus, these little green men are heroes, carved side by side with the heroes of old Chersonesus. This complex, from the carvings on its walls to the artifacts within, is here to tell a story, or rather, to make a story true. To understand it, we have to look back before there was such thing as Ukraine or Russia. These buildings don't just claim Crimea, they claim Rome. Though ground wasn't broken on the museum complex until early 2021, to the north, and despite the cries of UNESCO in many cases underneath the new monuments, is something much older. These gridded walls are the unearthed remains of Chersonesus, originally a Greek colony founded 2,500 years ago. By the time Catherine the Great of Russia conquered Crimea and founded Sevastopol in 1783, the city had been abandoned for well over 300 years. But then, as of now, these waist-high crumbling walls are caught in a frenzy of myth-making. Through its long and complicated history, the city was Greek, then Roman, and remained part of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire until 987, when it was conquered by Vladimir the Great, the Prince of Kiev. It's here, with this man, that our story begins. Alongside the modern conqueror of Crimea, this inexplicably intact building shares a name with the ancient prince. This is St. Vladimir Cathedral, and is older than its cousins to the south. It was finished in 1876 under the Russian Empire. It's built on the supposed site where Vladimir the Great was baptized, marrying into Byzantine royalty and spurring the conversion of the ancient Kievan Rus to Christianity. While the details of this story remain hotly debated, including whether the ceremony took place in Chersonesus or in Kiev, this moment has been elevated to be central to Russian identity and central to the nation's conquests. If you listen to Putin speak on Ukraine and Crimea, you'll hear again and again the same assertion. Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that there's a shared mentality, a shared culture, shared traditions, and of course, a shared history. This narrative of history is invariably tied to the Kievan Rus, the first Eastern Slavic medieval state, which encompassed what is today the respective heartlands of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. A few hundred years after Vladimir's Christianization, the many principalities which made up the Kievan Rus would fall to Mongol invasion, and its already diverse population would diverge into a myriad of different dynasties, religions, and migrations. Crimea itself would exist under Muslim Tatar rule for over 300 years, as the ruins of Chersonesus were slowly buried. As the modern notion of Russia emerged from the collapse of the Mongols and grew to encompass the former bounds of the Kievan Rus and far beyond, this history was dug up and recontextualized. The centralizing Russian state was in need of a unified national myth, and it was from the stones of Chersonesus that it drew an answer. Third Rome. Okay, stick with me. Emerging first after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, figures in the Russian Orthodox Church began to claim Moscow as the legitimate successor to Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman civilization, citing Vladimir the Great's marriage to the Byzantine royal family. In pinning the origins of its statehood to the Christianized Kievan Rus, early modern Russia legitimized its expansions into Eastern Slavic lands as a continuation of that medieval kingdom, and positioned itself as the protector of all Orthodox Christians within its geopolitical rival, the Ottoman Empire. It was here in Sevastopol, a naval base turned town, where these ambitions ran the hottest. Today, with hundreds of tumultuous years now past, these same ideas are being rolled out as truth and carved into stone for the sake of geopolitics.
This city was once called Constantinople. 6 centuries ago, it was the capital city of what was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest civilizations in world history, the Byzantine Empire.
The man getting edged off the sidewalk is Tikhon Shevkunov, as of 2023 the Metropolitan of the new Russian Orthodox Diocese of Crimea, and close friend of Vladimir Putin. This footage is from his 2009 documentary, The Fall of an Empire, The Lesson of Byzantium. In it, the bishop draws a through line from Byzantine civilization and religion to modern Russia. The lesson in question is that decentralization and rampant oligarchs were the internal issues which brought the empire down. Shevkunov has also expressed this belief regarding the Kievan Rus itself, that a lack of clear succession deprived the civilization of strong centralizing leaders. By his estimation, Russian civilization has found its man in Putin. A Putin quote is plastered prominently beneath a banner of buy a ticket buttons on the About page of the museum website. He toes the line better than I could ever explain it. Quote, Prince Vladimir was not only baptized in Chersonesus and his retinue, but then he began to spiritually unite and united all Slavic tribes living in this territory. This, in fact, formed the basis for the construction of a single centralized Russian state. In this sense, this place is truly sacred and very important for the Russian state. It's with this grand ideological backdrop that Bishop Tikhon consecrated the Chersonesus Museum and Temple Complex on the 1036th anniversary of Vladimir the Great's baptism, July 28th, 2024. As I'm fighting through this tangle of ancient ideologies and shining 3D renders of Greek revival palaces, I click on buy a ticket, and suddenly the story is a lot simpler. 1,000 rubles for the basic ticket, that's about $12. 750 for residents of Russian-occupied Ukraine who hold Russian citizenship, and a breezy 500 for participants in the SVO, Special Military Operation. The war. As Ukrainian and Russian blood pools together into the muddy steppe to the north, a familiar hand has tightened around Crimea. Since 2014, Russia has made life hell for those in occupied Crimea without Russian citizenship. From seizing property, denying loans, shuttering non-Russian language schools, and the closure of non-Russian places of worship. This heavy hand betrays a truth which New Chersonesus vainly tries to dazzle away. These lands were never just Russian. There's no 1,000-year Slavic fairy tale which ordains the Russian Navy as the rightful owners of a Black Sea naval base. Before the invasion, around 60% of the 2.5 million people in Crimea were ethnically Russian, followed by 24% Ukrainians and 12% Crimean Tatars. In the 10 years since annexation, perhaps up to 800,000 Russians have moved into the territory, and around 50,000 Ukrainians have left for the mainland. The form of ethnic cleansing the museums and temples at Chersonesus serve to justify is not new to Crimea. 81 years ago, as the Red Army liberated Poland, Stalin ordered the total deportation of the Crimean Tatars from the peninsula. Soviet officials justified it as a collective punishment for a minority which had collaborated with the occupying Nazis, and removed the entire population of 200,000 to Uzbekistan. The ban on return was only lifted by Gorbachev in 1989, of which around 150,000 eventually did. The Tatar story is one in a long series of population transfers, first under the Russian Empire and then under the Soviet Union, which served to scatter and weaken non-Russian national identities, especially in sensitive border regions like Crimea. Then, as now, the assertion that Crimea is ethnically Russian is a geopolitical chess piece, indifferent of the true diversity on the ground. This is why Russia has been fast-tracking residents in occupied Ukraine for Russian citizenship. The gambit is to force the legend of Novorossiya into reality, to carve a demographic truth where there was none, and to point to it when peace talks come knocking. This is why New Chersonesus is built on plowed archaeological sites, why archaeologists internationally are decrying the destruction and discarding of Tatar, Ukrainian, and other artifacts unearthed in Russia's illegal excavations on the site. These are museums of history only as far as that history will bend to geopolitical aims, and successive governments in Moscow have found legends to be a far better lapdog than anything dug up on this rocky shoreline. So what is the truth in Chersonesus, in Sevastopol, in Crimea? What is true is that no one people has ever called this land home. If you begin to dig into these borders, try to draw them through Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, every denomination of Muslim, Christian, try to sift up and assign every piece of ancient pottery to a people, and to assign every people to respective stories and legends, to national character and to birthright, you'll end up with a red disputed line around every last person. There's no height where you can draw lines and make legend into truth, and no arbitrary demographic ratio which legitimizes a government built on the inherent fallacy, the lie, that is an ethno-state.